my background, which I think is worth sharing, is I kind of came of age as a legal aid lawyer in Philadelphia, representing poor people with disabilities, and that is kind of the perspective that I bring to this stuff, right? So I came to love Social Security, and I will use the word love, because my clients really counted on the Social Security system to put a roof over their heads, to put food on the table, to be able to live independently and not live in institutions. That was really how I came to love Social Security, and so that's why I care about it. It's why I work on it. Next slide. So I think it's useful, if we're talking about Social Security, to sort of start with why we even have the program. I appreciated in the intro, you mentioned 1935, FDR, right? So I find it useful to sort of start with the purpose of Social Security as it was articulated when it was signed into law. So it was about the security of the men, the women, the children of the nation against the certain hazards and vicissitudes of life. Now, besides the fact that vicissitudes is an awesome word that we should use a lot more, I think this is useful because it sort of reminds us that it was about protection against the unpredictable, and that's really what Social Security is about. Some parts of it are predictable. Retirement, I will get old, right? We can predict that. We can hope for that. But other parts of it are not ones we can predict, like I will get hit by a car tomorrow and not be able to continue my life the way I expected. Next slide. So with that as the purpose, the way Social Security was constructed and the way it's grown up over 50 years is its protection in the form of kind of a full suite of insurance for American workers and their families. And I think an important thing to point out is that it's insurance that we would never be able to afford on the private market. Now, I say we, I don't know about you guys, maybe you are more like Abby Huntsman than I am, maybe you can afford this on the private market, but for the most part, most of us couldn't afford the level of protection that we get through Social Security on the private market. Next slide. So who benefits from Social Security? I think one way to answer that question is to say who actually gets benefits, who's currently receiving benefits from Social Security. By that measure, nearly 60 million American workers and their families are currently receiving benefits from Social Security. As I think was said earlier, it's become really a bedrock of economic security for people of all ages, not just older folks, people really of all ages. I'll get into that in a minute. And without it, nearly half of seniors would be poor, as would millions more people with disabilities, which I'll get into a little bit, as well as children who have lost their breadwinner parents. But I think the more complete answer for who benefits from Social Security is everyone who's protected by Social Security. And that's especially the case, I think, when it comes to Social Security disability and survivor's benefits, given that you never know when you might lose a breadwinner parent or spouse, or when you might face disability, injury, or illness. Now, putting that reality in stark numerical terms for this room, and I can say this as an us because it turns out I'm a millennial, a 20-year-old today has a 1 in 4 chance, 1 in 4, of facing disability before reaching the full retirement age of 67. 1 in 4. That's kind of crazy, right? We're often called the young invincibles. We think nothing's ever going to happen to us. 1 in 4, right? So by that measure of who's protected by Social Security, more than 9 out of 10 American workers and their families, and probably everybody sitting in this room, I'm going to guess, is protected by Social Security in case of death, disability, or retirement. Next slide. So I think it's important to sort of ask the question, what are the alternatives? Right? So part of what makes Social Security such a critical source of protection is that relatively few workers have access to affordable alternative sources of comprehensive coverage. Half of us lack private pension coverage, 4 in 10 have no employer-based life insurance, and very few, 1 in 3 civilian workers has employer-based long-term disability insurance, right? So those are what the alternatives would be. That's how few of us actually have them. And I think also instructive was in the Great Recession, we really saw, as I think Alex often calls it, and I think this is a good way to put it, 401ks become 201ks, right? We saw what happened with private investments. So Social Security ends up being that thing that we really all have to rely on, and that's just something I'm gonna build on as we move on. So next slide. So something I was asked to talk about a little bit is disability insurance. So who is aware of the fact that Social Security is not just for retirees? Okay, we've learned something today. Who's aware of the fact that Social Security includes a program called disability insurance? Okay, a few people. I appreciate the honesty. I've got a no in the front row, right? So I was asked to zoom in for a little bit on Social Security disability insurance, and I think that's important to do because A, a lot of people don't know it exists, and B, a lot of the people who do know it exists only know things that aren't true about it. So I'm just going to say that honestly, right, as someone who works on this a lot. So Social Security disability insurance is a core component of our Social Security system, which, as I showed in that slide about a suite of insurance products, it really is a system. So who receives Social Security disability insurance, which I will, for purposes of shortening the number of syllables I utter today, call DI? Who receives DI? So we've got 56 million, which is about 1 in 5 Americans, who live with disabilities. Now, 38 million, who about 1 in 10, live with severe disabilities. Just those individuals who actually have the most significant, most severe disabilities, illnesses, injuries, qualify for DI. So that's my, not quite to scale, but pretty close circles comparing those numbers. Next slide. To qualify for Social Security disability insurance, or DI, you have to be unable to engage in what's called substantial gainful activity. That basically means that because of a medically determinable impairment, either physical, mental, maybe both, which is expected to last 12 months or result in death, you really can't do any work on a full-time basis. That's basically what the definition of disability is in this country. And it's actually incredibly strict. According to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, we have the strictest, harshest definition of disability in the entire developed world. The only country that has a stricter standard is Korea. Okay, so that's how strict our definition is. That is how disabled you have to be to get benefits in this country under Social Security. By design, we actually have a 5-month waiting period, so it's not just that you have to be really, really disabled, you also have to wait, right? So that's how we've constructed the system in our country. And it's not just about can you do the job that you were doing before, can you do any of the other jobs you did before, it's about can you do any jobs in the entire national economy on a full-time basis. That is what we ask in this country before you can get benefits. Okay, next slide. So who actually gets benefits? Here's just a smattering. It's a really diverse group, right? I'm not going to go into serious detail on this, but it ranges from people with severe illnesses like heart disease, end-stage renal failure, cancer, multiple sclerosis, emphysema, on and on and on. Intellectual disabilities, severe mental illness, schizophrenia, debilitating depression. It's a wide range. Next slide. It's people who are in really poor health. It's people who are in worsening health. It's people who are terminally ill. A really, really staggering statistic to me that sums it up is 1 in 5 male and nearly 1 in 6 female beneficiaries of DI die within 5 years of getting benefits. That is how sick a lot of these people are. Next slide. And beneficiaries are more than 3 times more likely to die than other people their age. That is how sick these people are. Next slide. Now, it's not all people who are old, right? It's not all people who are even close to retirement age. Nearly a third of beneficiaries are between 31 and 49. I think that's something that a lot of people don't know. And as I said before, but I think is worth reiterating, a 20-year-old today has a 1 in 4 chance of becoming disabled and needing these benefits before you reach the Social Security retirement age. So it's here for you to protect you until you get to that point at which you actually have a planned retirement. Next slide. Benefits are incredibly modest. I think if you watch Fox News, you probably think people are sitting on their couches eating bonbons and leading the good life while they get Social Security disability. That's not the case. The average disabled worker benefit is actually just $11.46 per month. Half of people get less than that. And even if you are trying to live on that, that is $38 per day. That's not even that much if you go to Starbucks a lot, right? Like you can exhaust that pretty quickly if you're having lattes. So for most workers, DI really falls short of the earnings that they had pre-disability. But that being said, next slide, they are incredibly vital to economic security. So it isn't as much as you made before you became disabled, which you didn't plan for, but it is hugely vital in terms of replacing income that you had so that you can actually put a roof over your head, put food on the table. Makes up the majority of income for over 70% of beneficiaries, makes up over 90% of income for nearly half of beneficiaries, and it plays a huge role in reducing poverty among people with disabilities. Next slide. More on poverty. Next slide. Okay. I've sort of discussed the purposes and effects of DI, right? Prevents poverty, prevents hardship, helps people actually access things they need like food, like a roof over their head. Next slide. I'm moving fast through this because I want to actually get to questions. So an example of a person, this is a real person, Carol. I have met her. She worked as a rare documents conservator at the Library of Congress, right? A job I think a lot of us in this room could actually see ourselves doing. She was hit by a car while she was riding her bike to work. We were just talking about perils of biking in this city, right? This is why I don't bike to my job, right? That being said, she was hit by a car. She suffers a severe traumatic brain injury. She's left with almost no short and long-term memory. She can't even help her first grade son do basic arithmetic homework anymore, right? But what is there for her? Social Security is there for her in the form of disability insurance. And because of DI, they don't lose their home. They can actually continue to pay their mortgage payments. They can try and rebuild their life. They can access the care that Carol needs so that she can try and actually recover. Next slide. So where do we go from here? I think a lot of what the media does when it comes to Social Security, and specifically to this disability program within Social Security, is to try to scare people. Oh my God, it's full of fraud. Oh my God, all these people are just lazy and unemployed and they're getting benefits. If they were to share the facts with you, like I just did, you would probably say, wait a second, I think that's an important program. I think that's there for me. I think that's there for my friend Ben. I think that's there for my neighbor, as opposed to, oh, I've heard all these things in the media. And I have to say personally, as someone who cares about this program because of what it means for people who don't have an alternative, it's frustrating to hear that being all of the kind of hullabaloo. So I'm going to ask a question. Who has heard, well, this is going to be of a subset of the people who had ever heard of Social Security disability insurance, but of those who had ever heard of the program, who's heard that it's going bankrupt? Showing of hands. Okay, cool. So it's not going bankrupt, right? You heard from Alex before and you heard from Ben before that the program is actually doing fine, right? It's actually really in sound financial shape. You wouldn't know that to hear what the media say about it. This is also true for disability insurance. The program is not going bankrupt. What needs to happen is something that's fairly routine, good governance kind of stuff. We need to equalize the solvency between two trust funds. This is something that's been done 11 times in the past because sometimes we have demographic shifts. We've got more people who need benefits from the old age survivors chunk of funding, or we've got more people who need funding or need benefits from the disability trust fund. This has happened 11 times in the past, equally in both directions. We've hit up on another one of those times, and that's just what Congress needs to do, and yet we're hearing all this kind of hullabaloo in the media about crisis, right? And for people who have very short memories, they don't remember that this happened as recently as 1995 when we decided we were going to get ourselves to the point that we're exactly at right now. So that being said, I've given you something that says Project Video, Project Computer. No, I've given you a quote from the last time we faced exactly the situation that we're at right now. And here was the Commissioner of Social Security. I love this quote. "I see little merit in doing anything less than financing these two trust funds on approximately equal terms. But the most important part, of course, is to maintain confidence in the Social Security system as a whole. It is damaging to have news stories about DI running out of money in 2 years." This is 1993. We know it won't be allowed to happen, but some opponents of Social Security have a heyday with this kind of news story. Sound familiar? I think it does. Next slide. So what is the future, right? We started to talk a little bit about options that we have, right? So this is actually polling data from a national survey that was done by the National Academy of Social Insurance. So it was asking the question of what do you, as taxpayers of all ages, and they actually included millennials in this survey, want to do to make sure that Social Security is there for us? And so they asked questions, and they got to this package that 7 out of 10 Americans preferred. And this is Americans in both political parties, actually all political parties, they also had independents, all income levels, and all ages. And what folks preferred, 7 in 10, was a package of reforms that would completely eliminate any long-term financing gap, that would actually bring in additional revenue, and that would increase benefits. And so what it did was it scrapped the cap. right? That people were all in favor. Let's totally scrap that cap. We think everyone, millionaires, billionaires, everyone should pay their fair share. We shouldn't have people who are paying January 1st, January 2nd, and then no other days for the rest of the year. We should have them paying in all year, just like the rest of us sitting in this room, right? That was number one. Number two was let's modestly and gradually raise that payroll tax rate, because you know what? We can afford to pay, as a person making $50,000 a year, 50 cents more out of every paycheck, right? I can afford that because to me it's worth it to have something I can retire on and that protects me in case I don't make it to retirement. We can actually make benefits more adequate by making them more accurately reflect the cost of living. That's called the COLA, right? The opposite of the chain CPI, which we started this conversation with, which would not more accurately raise your cost of living. And lastly, let's protect people who are low-wage workers, right? There's something called the special minimum benefit. Let's raise that so that if you're a low-wage worker your whole life paying in, you don't have to retire in poverty. So this was the package that across the political spectrum, across ages, across incomes, people said they wanted. So question to you, why don't we hear this in the media? Why don't we hear this in Washington? What is going on with the gap? Why do we only hear about cuts? So I'm going to close with 5 statements about why millennials should give a shit. I just said that. I hope that's okay on your radio show. Number one.
New era.
Excellent. Thank you. Have me back anytime. So number one, we will need it, as Ben said, likely even more than our parents do, right? And this is just based on having declining share of pensions and other kinds of alternatives to rely on, right? So Social Security is going to be even more important for us when we retire. Number two, it's going to be there for us unless we let the conservative attacks undermine the system and result in cuts, right? So why let that happen? Why not just actually rely on facts and what we know and say, wait a second, we don't want those conservative attacks to undermine the system. We know it's going to be there for us. Let's do what we have to do to shore it up. Number three, as we've talked about, it benefits Americans of all ages, including, get this, 3.5 million millennials today, right? It's not just about old people. It's about people of all ages. It's also about more than 1 million kids. Okay, number four, keeps our parents from being our roommates, right? We're going to cut Social Security so they can't afford to live on their own. What are they going to do? They're going to move back in with us, right? That's what's going to happen. Okay, number five, because it's a false choice to say we have to cut Social Security because we have this, incredible deficit or this debt or we can't afford it or we've got this other stuff that we've got to invest in. It's a false choice. We can afford what we want to afford. A budget is really a statement of priorities, right? You saw the graph from Alex. We don't have a scary red line that looks like that. We have a pretty stable, not scary red line, right? So we can afford what we want to afford. So don't let people set up that false choice.